Europe has issued a tough ultimatum to the Kremlin for signing a peace agreement, which contains strict demands for Russia. And these demands even surprised the Europeans themselves. In short, achieving peace is not just about Ukraine making concessions. For example, Europe is demanding that Moscow withdraw its troops from Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia. Russia is required to pay reparations not only to Ukraine but also to European countries. Elections in Russia must be held under international supervision so that the dictator Putin cannot falsify them. No amnesty for Russians for war crimes, and also Russia must reduce its army and rewrite its legislation. Of course, all these demands sound maximalist, but friends, they fully reflect the insane demands that Russia makes of Ukraine and Europe, and such demands did not appear out of nowhere. European intelligence agencies have stated that Putin is using peace negotiations to get closer to America and make favorable deals with Donald Trump, not to stop the war. In this episode, let's go over Europe's demands to Russia together and discuss why some have already called this a supposed prolongation of the war. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together before we start this episode. I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and leave your comment below. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as soon as it comes in. So, the head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, sent a document to the member states of the European Union called Europe's Core Interests in Ensuring Comprehensive Justice, Core Lasting Peace and Security of the Continent, with a list of steps that Russia must take to achieve peace in Ukraine. Finally, someone has done this. Because Putin only keeps saying that he really wants peace, but what are the demands for Putin? What does this balding loser have to do to end the war? Well, the Europeans have put out this list. I know that now unwashed Russians will come into the comments and start squawking about how they don't like any of this, how they don't care, and so on. But this episode is for reasonable viewers, not for swamp creatures. So in the document that Kaja Kallas sent to her partners, it talks about reducing the number of occupation troops. That is, Russia must reduce its army, withdraw occupiers not only from Ukraine, but also from the territories of neighboring states, pay reparations, and implement democratic reforms in Russia. The document states that, although the European Union is not directly represented at the negotiating table in the talks that Ukraine, Russia, and the United States have been holding in recent months, its countries are financing a significant part of the support for Kyiv. Therefore, Europe has the right to make such demands. The document also contains points that fall under the competence of the European Union, particularly regarding Ukraine's accession to the European Union. Europeans insist that without their participation in the negotiations and consideration of their interests, lasting peace is impossible. As stated in the document, achieving peace does not only mean concessions from Ukraine, they say it's enough to pressure Ukraine, as Donald Trump does. Now Europe needs to discuss what Russia must do for the European Union to send its envoy there for negotiations. Let me remind you, Emmanuel Macron is promoting exactly this idea, asking why we handed over the entire negotiation process to the Americans. Although some have called the European Union's demands maximalist, they actually correspond to those presented by the Russians. So, what concessions is Brussels demanding from Russia? I'll list them next. First, if Kyiv agrees to reduce the size of the armed forces of Ukraine and withdraw them from certain areas at the front, Moscow must similarly reduce the Russian army and withdraw Russian occupiers from the front line. Second, there is no need to legally recognize the occupied territories. They need to be demilitarized. Third, Russia must stop disinformation campaigns, sabotage, cyber attacks, and violations of airspace against Europe. Fourth, Russians cannot interfere in elections in European countries and neighboring states. Fifth, nuclear weapons must be removed from the territory of Belarus. Sixth, the Kremlin must also withdraw Russian military presence from Belarus, Ukraine, and the Republic of Moldova. This is the first time that unwashed Russians are being told to get out of all the occupied territories, pack their things, and leave. Seventh, a general amnesty for the Russian Federation for war crimes must be prohibited, not even discussed. All these war criminals must be held accountable. Eighth, Russia must provide access for international investigators to possible crime scenes. Ninth, International obligations must take priority over the internal legislation of the Russian Federation. 10th, Russia must pay reparations not only to Ukraine, but also to European countries and companies, and compensate for environmental damage. 11th, elections in the Russian Federation must be held under international supervision. This is exactly a mirrored response to the Kremlin, which was shouting about the need to introduce external governance in Kiev in order to hold elections, and to remove Zelensky and the current government of Ukraine from power. Europe is saying to Moscow, let's do the same thing and then we can talk. 12th point, the Kremlin is obliged to release political prisoners. 13th, the return of deported civilians and children. 14th, adherence to the principles of media freedom. 15th, the repeal in the Russian Federation of legislation restricting the activities of independent media and civil society. 16th, the Russian Federation must cooperate in the investigation of the deaths of opposition politicians Alexei Navalny and Boris Nemtsov. It is also reported that now the ambassadors of European Union countries must discuss this document, and after that, certain provisions of it may be submitted for consideration by the bloc's foreign ministers. All this is necessary in order to try to restore direct contact between Europeans and Russians. I would like to note that the idea of resuming contacts with the Kremlin as part of peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine has already caused a certain split within the European Union. Some states are calling for the appointment of a special envoy to negotiate with the unwashed Russians, as was done in the White House by appointing Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Others insist that Russia must first make concessions, and only then can some format of dialogue be discussed. And here, some have stated that with such demands Europe is only prolonging the war. Why? Because Vladimir Putin will never agree to this. But today, the heads of European intelligence agencies are pessimistic about the chances of reaching an agreement this year to end Russia's war against Ukraine, despite the statement by American President Donald Trump that United States brokered talks have brought the prospect of a peace agreement closer. Well, first of all, today the Kremlin has already stated that United States mediation is already in question. They don't like that Trump, for example, not only puts pressure on Ukraine, but also imposes sanctions against the Russian oil sector. Like, what is that about? If Trump is a mediator, then he should be completely on Moscow's side. Well, we understand that the logic of the Muscovites is extremely twisted, and they believe that mediation means you have to be on their side. So, let's get back to the conclusions of European intelligence based on the statements of the heads of 5 European intelligence agencies. They say that Russia doesn't want to end the war quickly, that Moscow is using negotiations with the United States to achieve the lifting of sanctions and to make business deals, not to end the war. And today, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov comes out and says, listen, we would gladly make some super profitable commercial and economic trade agreements with the Americans. We would gladly let the Americans develop our oil and gas fields and so on. But, he says, sanctions are preventing this from starting, hinting that the Americans should lift the sanctions first and then we can discuss cooperation. Well, there you have it. These remarks from European intelligence point to a striking difference in views between European capitals and the White House, which wants to reach a peace agreement before June, ahead of the United States midterm elections in Congress in November. And Trump says that, in his opinion, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin really wants to reach a peace agreement. But in Europe, they are sure that this is complete nonsense. And the Russians themselves confirmed it today. The Kremlin reminded that for achieving peace in Ukraine, Putin still demands the actual dismantling of NATO. The day before, the Russian Foreign Ministry stated that Russia will demand from NATO a legal guarantee of non-expansion as part of a peace deal. These demands include the withdrawal of forces and systems from countries that joined the alliance after 1997. Moreover, Putin demands that NATO abandon its open-door policy, eastern expansion, and partnerships on the eastern flank, including with Ukraine. Therefore, Europe's demand for the Muscovites to withdraw Russian troops from all occupied regions, not only in Ukraine but also, for example, in Moldova and Georgia, no longer seems so outrageous. Plus, of course, I realize that these are extremely maximalist demands. Sorry for the tautology. Indeed, if we live in the real world, we understand that Moscow will not fulfill all these demands, and we understand that these are demands voiced in an ideal democratic world. But it's important to understand that if Europe puts forward such demands, it means it won't fall for any deal that might arise between Putin and Trump. And for example, if Trump actually starts lifting American sanctions against Russia, the European Union will not do the same. If he sets these demands for Moscow, he will say, listen, we would gladly lift the European sanctions, but here is our list of demands. Let Putin fulfill them, then we will lift the sanctions, and then we can talk. So, in this way, Europe regains its agency in this situation. And also don't forget that, for example, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication System, bank transfers, won't be unblocked for Moscow without Brussels' consent, no matter how much Donald Trump wants it. Why? Yes, because the headquarters of this organization is still in Europe, and it is managed by Europe. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to like if you found this episode interesting and useful. You can support our YouTube channel financially with your donation or a paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. There are a variety of platforms there, so choose the one that's most convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you can give. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.